Switzerland, a country woven from brutal cold. When you climb into the mountains, you feel the frost reach for your inner warmth, even through layers of winter clothing. There's no escape from this monstrous, snowy beast. Neither a campfire, nor a cozy fireplace, nor even the relief of numbness can save you. All you can do is grit your teeth and endure the cold, like you'd endure a toothache. How much I've grown to despise it. Words can't express the hatred I feel. But at least I'm not suffering alone. Oh no, I can clearly see old Chuck shivering and chattering his teeth. God almighty, what's the temperature out here? -100? I can feel it in my frozen balls. You've only got yourself to blame for all this, Mills snapped at Chuck's endless whining. We could have waited till morning, but you just had to drag us up here in the dead of night in this freezing cold. Well, excuse me, Your Highness, Chuck replied. You know as well as I do that time is money, and if we get there first, the money is ours. That fact was something Chuck and I, and especially Mill, agreed on. Our trio, a team of journalists, had set out to get the scoop before anyone else even knew what was happening. In our line of work, if a rumor about a sensational event started spreading, every media worker in the area would race to the scene, doing whatever it took to get there first. A lot of throat-slitting happens in the name of fame, be it for a TV station, newspaper, or radio show. Especially when nothing of interest had happened in town, the mountains, or anywhere nearby for a long time. The competition for ratings was something we were all well used to. Do you really think this scoop is worth my frozen balls? Chuck kept on. I'm telling you, Rat is lying again. Last time he gave us some bogus info too. Said there was a Yeti corpse found behind the village of Anvert. But when we got there, all we saw was some bum pissing on my Jeep and a weird-looking elderly couple. That couple was the source of the whole thing, Chuck groaned, clearly still bitter about that day. They explained they were just bored without visitors, so they made up the story to get someone to show up. But the worst part wasn't the lie or the wasted trip. It was that we missed a pretty good hockey game on TV. Chuck tried to fish an unopened pack of Dunhill cigarettes out of his back pocket, bought on the way here. Failing, he continued ranting, cursing about everything under the sun. Mill and I were trying our best to ignore his performance. Funny as it is to admit, Chuck might have been right. Rat could have fed us another load of nonsense instead of a real scoop. I'd heard rumors that Rat was spending money on junk. It could be that he was broke and going through withdrawal, which gave him the bright idea to sell us this dude of a story to make some quick cash. We called him Rat because our informant didn't like using his real name and offered the alias as a way to keep his identity secret. The guy had a talent for inventing stories and feeding them to us as facts. Of course, every now and then he'd tell the truth. Otherwise, we would have stopped listening to him long ago and turned him in for drug use. Chuck didn't trust him, and neither did I, but there was a reason we kept working with him. Nothing ever happens here, and any news is better than no news, Mill, Rat's biggest supporter, always reminded us. Mill was the brains of our team. He came up with headlines, dug through people's dirty laundry, figuratively speaking, and found the truth even in places where it seemed impossible. He was also the one who pushed for this trip into the mountains so early. I couldn't help but wonder if he was out of his mind. Unlike Chuck and me, Mill didn't fear the cold. A broad-shouldered, heavy-set man, he was more inconvenienced by the climb itself than by the biting wind that tore through the mountain slopes. He'd just turned 40 recently, and that milestone brought a long, unpleasant bout of depression for everyone at the paper. Exercise would do him good, but if you ever dared to suggest, or even hint, that he needed to lose weight, he'd send you to a place you wouldn't want to crawl back from. People often picture overweight guys as jolly and kind, but Mill was anything but. His face was always stern and unwelcoming, further emphasized by the battered old fur hat he wore, which barely covered his shiny, bowling ball-like bald head. He also sported decent quality white leather boots. His small, dark green eyes concealed intelligence and a streak of boldness. As fearsome as he might look, he was still a sweetheart compared to my other companion. It was Chuck who people really needed to be afraid of. Gaunt, hunched, and pale, so pale in fact that the snow looked like a black void in comparison to his complexion. His grim outlook on life didn't help matters. His crooked nose made him look like a medieval sorcerer preparing to sacrifice a virgin. He wasn't even 30 yet, but he looked older than both Mill and me. Chuck always dressed in 3 coats to avoid freezing anything off. But he'd only been working in Switzerland for 2 years and still needed more time to get used to the harsh, unforgiving winters here. He used to shoot photos for a small paper in Miami. He brought one of those issues along to show off his creative approach and talent as a photographer. But in reality, his skills only shone through when he'd had a few too many drinks. The local booze brought him more joy than working at the paper or chasing stories in the freezing cold. "Ryan, tell Mill that it's not worth it, and we should head back to the office and think about how we got suckered by Rat yet again," Chuck said, sounding exhausted. "But what if it's real, Chuck?" Mill shot back. "And we miss out on a huge opportunity just because one whiner decided chasing stories wasn't as fun as drinking beer at home till he passed out." The story Rat had passed along was that a friend of his had seen a large object crash into the mountains, something that looked like a rocket. According to the friend, there was a loud bang, like a couple of propane tanks exploding or maybe even a ballistic missile going off. Of course, we could have chosen not to believe Rat's so-called friend. He might have been another junkie hallucinating. But there were more reliable rumors suggesting that there was a small military range behind the mountain where they kept fighter jets. It was possible that one of those jets, with its pilot, had lost control and crashed in the mountains. "Maybe Chuck's right," I chimed in, siding with Chuck because, like him, I was itching to go home. Just to be sure, I asked Mill, "You did call the rescue team, right? Do you think I'm an idiot?" Mill shot back, his tone colder than the mountain air. "If there really is wreckage up there, there could also be a frozen but still alive pilot in need of immediate medical help. So of course I called the rescue team first and then you guys. I didn't see any rescuers on the way up here," Chuck said, with a hint of unease in his voice. As soon as we reached the base of the mountain, the blizzard blocked the road with snow, which probably delayed them. They should be here in 20, maybe 30 minutes max. Mill spoke calmly, maybe a bit too calmly. "Maybe we should have waited for them to arrive before we started heading toward the crash site," Chuck suggested. "What's this about a UFO? Do you believe in aliens now?" Mill snapped, clearly annoyed. "No, I'm just saying, what fell out of the sky sure seems like the closest thing to a UFO," Chuck replied defensively. "Guys, if we keep standing here in the cold, the rescuers will have to come for us instead of the pilot," I said, not enjoying the direction the conversation was heading. "Let's hurry up before some other journalists show up looking for a scoop." During these little squabbles between Mill and Chuck, I liked playing peacemaker. Helping smooth things over often earned me a free drink later. But today, in these cursed mountains, there was no alcohol, no cigarettes, no joy. Just cold, arguments, and endless darkness. "How much farther do we have to go to get to this so-called scoop?" Chuck asked, sounding tired as he picked up his photographer's gear. A camera, several lenses, a week's supply of whiskey or brandy, and a tripod. Rat's friend said the rocket fell somewhere in the central part of the mountain, and at the time, he was standing at a gas station looking at the southern side of this big white giant, and since it's about 2,000 feet, just tell me how much longer. Chuck cut off Mill's rambling explanation. Probably another hour or so, Mill replied, sounding hurt. The higher we climbed, the deeper we sank into snowdrifts. In our haste, we hadn't bothered to bring the right gear for a mountain trek. It would have been impossible to rent any equipment at this hour, so we'd given up on looking and decided to wing it. It was hardest on me, though, because on top of the cold, I was weighed down by Mill's bag, which I'd lost a bet and now had to carry for him. The damn thing must have weighed at least 60 pounds. Curious about its contents, I asked Mill, "What did you pack in here? A dead pilot?" "Everything we need," Mill replied evasively. "Care to be more specific?" "Some food, water, paper, and my typewriter," he added casually, as if that last item wasn't completely absurd. "A typewriter in the mountains? What, are you trying to reenact Stephen King's Misery?" I asked, dumbfounded. "You never know when it might come in handy," Mill answered, completely unfazed by the fact that I wasn't thrilled about lugging a typewriter up a mountain. But before I could give him a piece of my mind, a bright flash of light and flame appeared ahead of us. "Hey, look up there!" I yelled, pointing toward a small clearing on the western slope of the mountain. "I think that's our crashed plane." "Then that's where we're headed," Chuck sighed heavily. "I'm not going near that fire," Mill protested. "I would, just to warm up." "I'm starting to think this cold might kill me," I said, my teeth chattering loudly. We continued our climb, our spirits lifted slightly by the sight of fire. A forest fire in the mountains was a far more exciting story than another dull weather report. The trees were spaced far enough apart that we could easily pinpoint the fire's exact location. Unfortunately, my glasses had frosted over, making it hard to see anything, so Mill, with his far-sighted vision, took on the role of scout. I should probably tell you a bit about myself in comparison to my companions. I'm average in height and build, just your typical middle-aged guy. I wear glasses. At Chuck's suggestion, I grew a short beard, something he claimed would suit me perfectly. Well, it doesn't, and I just haven't found the time to shave it off yet. For the climb into the mountains, I put on my old, worn-out fur coat, 2 pairs of pants, and a warm hat, just like Mill's, but newer. That's about all that needs to be said. If you've seen one average guy in glasses, you've seen them all, and that's exactly what I am. In our team of journalists, I'm the backup, the one who sits on the bench waiting for the coach's whistle. I write articles Mill doesn't want to bother with or touch up his own when he's possessed by the booze demon. Most of the time, I end up writing about things I come across during walks in town or outside it. Nothing sensational, mostly just the everyday lives of the people living in this small town in the Swiss mountains. "Let's take a break, guys," Mill suggested, panting from the steep climb. "But we're almost there. Why stop now?" I knew that if we paused, I'd fall into a snowdrift and stay there until the rescue team showed up. "Because I need to go into the bushes for a minute," Mill said quietly, grabbing the bag with his essentials. "In this cold?" Chuck laughed, but Mill ignored him. "Fine. I was going to check the lenses on my camera anyway." Chuck shrugged, smiling like a hyena at a circus show. Mill disappeared behind the trees. To kill time, I suggested we pull out our radio to see if the news about the fallen plane had spread yet. The radio belonged to our newspaper, and they gave it to me because no one else used it anymore. I brought it along thinking it might come in handy out here in the wilderness. And considering how often the cell signal cuts out due to snowstorms, it was stupid to hope for anything better. But after a minute of scanning through static, I managed to find a news station. "Whoa, I didn't know this thing actually worked," Chuck said, surprised at the radio's functionality. "We're high up, and the snowstorm seems to be easing off, so it's not that surprising," I explained. "I thought it didn't even have batteries." I stopped fiddling with the dial as soon as I heard a familiar voice coming through the speakers. "Damn. The blizzard's keeping us from getting to the base of the mountain. The corpse at the gas station isn't making things easier." Through the static, Chuck and I could hear the reporter talking with the police chief, Brown Venton. They were discussing not only the plane crash, but also an unidentified dead body. The situation was starting to seem a lot less promising. That whiff of a good story was beginning to smell like death. "Wait, did he just say something about a corpse at the gas station?" Chuck shouted, furious. "And we're freezing our asses off in the mountains chasing a junkie's bogus tip about a fallen plane? This is so unfair." "Hey, maybe if we keep waiting for Mill, we'll have a corpse of our own to write about. And come on, a plane crash in the mountains is way more exciting than a dead guy at a gas station." I tried to calm Chuck down, even though all this talk of corpses wasn't exactly sitting well with me. Honestly, I'd rather be writing about the weather. "That's not the point," Chuck grumbled. "I'm pissed because we're up here in these freezing mountains instead of at that warm and cozy gas station." "Stop whining. Let me hear what they're saying," I snapped. Aside from the cold, another monster was creeping up on me. Fear. The kind that strikes suddenly and without a word. Turning the volume all the way up, we heard the hoarse voice of the police chief. "It all started when we headed toward the base of the mountain with the rescue team after receiving information that a plane had crashed up there and the pilot needed immediate medical attention," the chief said loudly and clearly, like he was the one delivering the news. His raspy voice reminded me of the lifeless slope of the mountain and the howling wind. But the blizzard blocked the road, and we had to call in a crew to clear the snow. "And what happened next?" asked a voice I didn't recognize, but Chuck thought it was the anchor from Channel 6. "Then we heard screams from the gas station, and when we got there, we found a dismembered body in the bathroom behind the station." "Good Lord," the anchor responded with a rehearsed tone of horror. "Tell me about it. It's like something out of Agatha Christie's 10 Little Indians." "But," the chief paused dramatically before adding, "our investigators found traces of drugs in the victim's system. Looks like an overdose, plain and simple." "But you said the body was dismembered. That doesn't quite fit with the overdose theory," the anchor pressed on. "Yes, the body was dismembered, but according to the investigators, it happened long after the overdose. Most likely a bear wandered into the bathroom. There are giant paw prints in the snow outside the door, and it seems the poor kid forgot to lock it. The bear tore open the chest cavity. Several organs are missing. Looks like the bear decided to have a feast." The chief cleared his throat, signaling it was time to change the subject. "That's all I can share for now. But once the road is cleared, we'll get to the station and conduct a more thorough investigation." "When will the road be cleared?" "Should be within the next 10 to 20 minutes. While the rescue team heads into the mountains, we'll deal with the dead body. And stop asking me questions already. Get out of here." Clearly fed up with the pushy reporters, Brown lost his cool and chased them off. "Hey, Ryan, you think that junkie who tipped off Rat about the rocket could be the same one?" Chuck asked. "Probably. This is a small town and the cops know most of the local junkies, perverts, and killers. What do you think, Mill?" I shouted toward the trees. No answer. Instead, a gust of wind hit me in the face, almost knocking my glasses off. "Mill, you done yet?" Chuck called, a bit more worried now. Chuck stood up, trying to spot Mill through the trees. Instead, he stumbled and fell into a snowdrift. I put the radio back in my backpack and got to my feet without any trouble. Before I could call out to Mill again, I helped pull Chuck out of the snow. "Pull harder, you wimp!" Chuck panted, laughing at my efforts. "Maybe if you took the damn bag off, you wouldn't be so heavy." After getting him upright, I shouted over the wind, "I think he went on ahead without us." "That sounds like him," Chuck muttered, though his voice carried hints of doubt and fear. The two of us started moving again, me leading, Chuck following behind. I could hear him chattering his teeth from the biting cold. This frost, combined with the fierce wind, was like a cocktail that would quench even the wildest weather's thirst. The strong, sturdy trees were now covered in frost, and the wind was shaking them back and forth, as if they were balloons ready to be untied and blown away. Dawn was approaching, but there was no sign of sunlight, and the forest remained shrouded in impenetrable darkness, dimly lit by the weak glow of the moon. But the closer we got to the crash site, the more the forest was bathed in shades of yellow and red. The world around us seemed to scream, "Turn back while you still can!" But the disappearance of our friend and the promise of a big scoop kept us moving forward. We'd come this far. There was no turning back now. As we trudged through the snow, Chuck fell into drifts at least 10 times. Something seemed determined to pull him into the snow's icy embrace. We were only a few yards away from the crash site when I suddenly heard a terrifying scream behind me, like the growl of an angry dog. Spinning around, I saw Chuck clinging to the bark of a tree, his body sinking into the white abyss of the snow. "God, I'm going to fall, Ryan! Do something!" Chuck screamed, flailing as he tried to hold on and not plunge into his newly formed grave. I grabbed his left hand while his right hand desperately clutched the tree trunk. His bag tumbled into the depths below, and only after what felt like an eternity did we hear the sound of bottles smashing at the bottom of the bottomless pit. I pulled with all my strength, but the wind kept knocking me off balance, trying to tear Chuck from my grasp and hand him over to the gaping jaws of death. Could this be how Mill had vanished too? Chuck's hand was slowly slipping out of mine, and I began to fear that I'd fall into the void with him. One death for the three of us. "Give me your right hand or I can't hold on," I shouted, my voice shaking with fear. "Don't let go of me! I'll give you my hand, but damn it, I want to live!" Chuck yelled, releasing the tree and letting me grab his right hand. I pulled with everything I had, as if I were a pack of hunting dogs dragging a sled. My glasses fell into the abyss, but I didn't care. I'd saved myself and my friend. I'd never felt such a mix of terror and relief in my life. I never thought I'd be this happy to fall into this damn freezing snow, Chuck said, panting and pausing after every word. "You should have watched where you were going," I scolded, my voice still tense. Then I added, "Do you think Mill could have fallen into a snow pit like that?" "We would have heard him scream if he had," Chuck said, getting to his feet and brushing off the snow before extending a hand to help me up. "Come on, enough lying around. We need to find Mill and check out that crashed plane." Taking Chuck's hand, I stood up and picked up the bag I'd dropped while rushing to save him. But as soon as I held it, I froze in horror, afraid to say a word. "What's wrong, Ryan?" Chuck asked. "This bag," I said, holding it up. "It's not mine." "If it's not yours, whose is it?" "I think it's Mill's." "He must have grabbed my bag by mistake," I replied, deciding to confirm it by opening the bag. Inside were packaged meals, meat and vegetables stuffed into small containers, kind of like astronaut food. There were also 3 bottles of mineral water, and next to that, a large stack of papers covered in handwritten notes. At the bottom was something big. I set the bag on the ground and reached in to pull out the unidentified object. Chuck, unnerved by my prolonged silence, asked the question neither of us really wanted the answer to. "So it's his bag?" "Looks like it," I replied, remembering that my bag had contained a first aid kit, worn and battered but never used, along with a few cans of food in case we got hungry during the trip. But it seems he lied to us about the typewriter. "What do you mean? Don't tell me he packed booze like I did?" Chuck asked, his voice filled with hope that I'd confirm his guess. "No booze," I disappointed him. "But this item is far more interesting." I pulled a small black, round object out of the bag. It looked like one of those fortune-telling balls that reveal your fate when you shake them. The firelight reflected off its surface, sending weak little beams of light, almost like fireflies, across it. "What the hell is that?" Chuck looked thoroughly unimpressed. "Is that a bowling ball? Is Mill messing with us?" The object was so smooth that it slipped out of my hands, and I barely caught it before it rolled down the slope. It had 3 small indentations, but they didn't match the size of my fingers, too narrow to be a bowling ball. No matter how hard we studied it, turning it over and inspecting every inch, its purpose and origin remained a mystery. "I guess we'll have to wait until we find Mill to figure out what this thing is," I concluded. Chuck remained silent. I looked at him with the same curiosity I'd had while examining the strange object in Mill's bag. His face unnerved me. It didn't show any human emotion. There was no fear, no joy, no irritation, no resentment. Even the chattering of his teeth from the cold had stopped. "Chuck, are you all right?" I asked. The moment I did, his face changed. Everything seemed to snap back to normal. The fear, the anger, the frustration at the obstacles in our path. "I think we need to hurry to the crash site. Mill's probably waiting for us there," he said, confirming that whatever had happened to him was just a fleeting lapse in his sanity. Maybe the fear and stress had caused me to imagine his detachment. Strange things happen. Chuck was right. If Mill wasn't in the forest and hadn't fallen into some hidden cave, then he must have made it to the crash site and was waiting for us there. I decided to leave the bag by the pit to speed up our ascent, but kept the mysterious sphere. I had a feeling it would come in handy. "Let's go," I told Chuck, and we resumed our trek through the snow, more cautiously than before. We finally reached our destination. From where we had narrowly avoided falling into the pit, it was only about 100 yards or so to the crash site. I kept looking over my shoulder every 10 yards, but there were no headlights from the rescue vehicles at the base of the mountain. Though with my poor eyesight and without my glasses, I was just grateful I could make out Chuck's silhouette as he cleared a path for us up the hill. In the middle of a small, snow-covered clearing, a fire was burning, but there were no signs of a crashed plane. Only the bright flames stood guard over the mountain, keeping the darkness at bay and waiting for the arrival of some knight in shining yellow armor. The fire outshone the moon, its light so intense that I had to shield my eyes with my hand to avoid being blinded by it. Then I noticed a figure standing behind the fire. Could it be the injured pilot? It seemed far-fetched. There was no evidence of a crash or explosion. Just a pile of burning wood and a massive blaze stretching toward the dark, clear sky. I shuddered. The shadow behind the fire began to move, heading toward Chuck and me. Without my glasses and with the fire's glare, I couldn't make out who it was. Chuck, who stood closer to the fire, must have been able to see more details or perhaps even recognize the figure, but it seemed like he was staring through the person, fixated on the fire. He was drawn to it, as if he longed to reach out and absorb its warmth. The stranger stood in front of us. Even with my poor vision, I recognized Mill. "Mill, buddy!" I shouted in excitement. "God, I'm so glad to see you. Why didn't you let us know you decided to come here alone?" He continued to stand there, staring at Chuck, his face expressionless. Chuck, in turn, remained silent, glaring at him with a mixture of anger and resentment. In Chuck's eyes, I saw the fire's reflection, but in Mill's eyes, nothing. I felt uncertain, confused, and increasingly scared of my best friends. The howling wind tried to cool the tension, but this northern gale was unlike the one that had greeted us at the mountain's base. It raged furiously, as if something was trying to break through and overpower it. I was trembling uncontrollably, but it wasn't just the cold. It was fear. Yet Chuck and Mill stood there, motionless, like eerie statues carved from stone. "Guys, this isn't funny anymore," I said, trying to suppress the fear and shaking in my voice and body. "Say something, for God's sake." But I doubted my words would have any effect on them. Suddenly, Mill turned his head toward me and spoke. "Ryan, you should leave while you still can. What's going to happen here isn't meant for your eyes," he said, his voice mechanical, emotionless. I was beginning to doubt that these were my real friends at all. The wind turned into a blizzard, a raging storm. I wasn't just talking anymore. I was shouting, hoping that my voice could reach every living thing on this cursed mountain. "What do you mean it's not for me? What are you two planning? Chuck, say something." It seems like the cold's gotten to Mill's head, and he doesn't even realize what he's saying. My pleas snapped Chuck out of his frozen state. Like Mill, he turned his head toward me. Unlike Mill, Chuck's face showed clear emotions. Despite the blizzard obscuring my vision, I could still make out a crazed smile on his face. Was it possible he took my words as a joke? "Hey, Mill." Chuck's voice was now filled with a furious tone, like a bulldog about to pounce on its prey. "Let Ryan stay. Sending him out into this nasty weather would be a death sentence." "Chuck, please," Mill begged, his calm voice returning, though the mask of emotionless detachment couldn't hold for long. "This is between you and me. Don't drag him into this. I think we should. After what's about to happen, he'll know too much. There's no reason to let him live." "Same goes for you, Mill." Chuck started laughing. His unhinged cackle terrified me even more than his words about killing Mill and me. The black sphere slipped from my grasp into the snow, and I nearly collapsed from the fear that had taken over my legs. Chuck seemed determined to make this cursed story a reality, the one that had driven us up the mountain in the first place. "Ryan, why are you so scared? You think I'm serious about killing you? It's a joke. Don't take stupid things like that so seriously." Chuck's attempt to reassure me only made things worse. He was lying through his teeth, his face unchanged, and laughing like he'd just told the world's funniest joke. "Don't worry, I won't kill you," Chuck continued, approaching me with that sick grin etched into his face. "At least, not before I finish off old Mill." This wasn't Chuck anymore, at least not the friend I'd drunk beer with at the bar, laughed with, and climbed this mountain to chase a story. This was someone, or something else. A hyena, a bulldog, but not Chuck. Mill still stood by the fire. It seemed like he and Chuck were gearing up for a fight. They'd always had their differences, but now this felt more like a war than some petty spat. "Step away from him," Mill shouted. "Let's settle this once and for all." Chuck turned his head and stared at Mill. Without breaking eye contact, he grabbed me by the arm, holding it like a pair of vice grips, and replied to Mill, "Fine. It's about time." Chuck threw me into a tree. It happened so suddenly that I couldn't react. He lifted me and tossed me like I weighed nothing. A searing pain shot through my body, starting in my back where I'd hit the tree. My ears were ringing and I think I broke a rib. My attempts to stand were in vain. The unbearable primal pain devoured me from the inside. All I could do was lift my head to catch a glimpse of the battle unfolding by the fire. But the blizzard had blanketed the area in an impenetrable white fog. It encircled the spot where Chuck and Mill stood, marking it as the arena for their gladiatorial combat. A tornado-like force swirled around them. Yet the fire remained burning, refusing to be snuffed out. Through the haze, I saw the shadows of my friends, or at least what had once been my friends. Chuck was transforming. His clothes tore to shreds, scattering like confetti. His body began to swell and rise toward the sky. He had been around 5 feet tall, nothing to complain about. But now he was growing, reaching the size of a bear. And it wasn't just his shadow that resembled the formidable forest beast. Chuck's arms elongated, turning into massive paws, complete with claws sharp enough to slice a person in half with a single swipe. His legs followed the same transformation, but none of that compared to the changes in his face. Chuck's crooked nose straightened, the hump disappearing as his nostrils flared. His ears morphed into something resembling those of a wolf, and his head expanded in size. His eyes now glowed bright red in the darkness, and his mouth, oh God, I couldn't bear to look. It was a living nightmare. Curiosity got the better of me, though, and despite my attempts to avert my gaze, I kept looking back. Chuck opened his massive jaws, and long, slimy strands of saliva began to drip onto the snow. I could see the enormous fangs protruding from both the top and bottom of his mouth, reminding me of a tusked animal. But I was wrong to compare this monster to a bear. What had once been Chuck, his body was now covered in thick white fur. He stood tall, back and head raised, making himself appear even larger to his opponent. But there was no doubt. He was dangerous and bloodthirsty, just like any other predator. This transformation left me in shock. Chuck had turned into a werewolf, or at least something resembling one. My breathing was fast and erratic, and I could feel my heart about to leap out of my chest. It was shrinking inside me, ready to make a leap of faith. Fear overwhelmed the pain. Now my attention shifted to Mill. His body was also changing, but not as drastically as Chuck's. Instead of turning into a monster, he radiated a brilliant light that nearly blinded me. When the light finally dimmed, I saw that Mill had transformed into a tall, athletic figure, as if carved from ancient Greek marble. He stood there, muscular and lean, the fat he'd gained from indulging in too much meat having magically disappeared. This was no longer the man I'd known. Another stranger had taken his place in the mountains. The blizzard and the bright glow made it hard to see his face, but I could guess that it too had undergone significant changes. His winter clothing had been replaced with summer garb. On his right chest glinted a badge that reminded me of the ones sheriffs wore in old westerns. In his hands he held something that looked like a gun. It had a long, wide barrel, but instead of a normal trigger, there was a strange tube leading to a holster. The tube glowed a dark green. Fake Mill pointed his weapon at the monster that had once been Chuck. In response, Chuck bared his massive fangs and let out a deafening howl. Maybe he was hinting to his opponent that a mouthful of sharp fangs was just as deadly as any firearm. Lying in the snow, I tried to make sense of what was happening. Could this be a nightmare or a hallucination? I wasn't sure which one it could be. But I knew one thing for certain. I had to get out of here as fast as I could. Forgetting the pain as best I could, I tried to stand. Lifting my heavy body, I fought to hold it upright, but my efforts were in vain. I realized there was no way I'd make it out like this. So I started crawling like a worm, pushing the snow behind me. It wasn't hard work, almost like swimming in a frozen lake. To my left, the battle raged on, but I did my best to ignore it. My mind needed a break from it all. Suddenly, something in my path blocked my escape. A snag in the wheel of my plans. It was that black sphere I'd pulled from Mill's bag and thrown away, hoping never to see it again. Without letting myself get distracted, I kept crawling toward the edge of the slope. During this stretch of time, I formulated a plan for my escape. Once I reached the hill, I'd roll down it, not caring what happened next, as long as I got as far away from this cursed place, its wild weather, and the madness in my friends' heads. A whistling sound cut through the air above me. I turned and saw a scorched hole in a tree. Apparently the fight was going well, but my mind was already far away. Fear was slowly being replaced by pain. I couldn't take it anymore, I screamed. As I tried to turn, a searing pain shot through my left leg. I forced myself to look at the wound, barely holding back nausea. The bone was sticking out, white and red mixed in the snow. My stomach turned again and I shut my eyes, trying not to look at the gruesome injury, then began inching my way toward the edge of the hill. Behind me, I heard Chuck's howls of pain. The battle continued, a fight to the death. As I listened to the struggle, I tried to figure out who was winning and who was about to lose. The roar of the blizzard was split by a sound like a whistle, likely Mill's weapon. Chuck erupted in maniacal laughter, making the ground beneath me shake, as if it were laughing along with him. And then, the laughter was silenced by a scream filled with agony. Mill had been struck. Without waiting for the fight to end, I pushed myself off the ground and rolled down the steep hill. But suddenly, I was suspended in the air. I couldn't see anything in front of me, only felt a deep cold, with my face buried in the snow up to my chin. Something had grabbed my leg. I had a pretty good idea who it was. The rancid breath of Chuck's maw burned my eyes, bringing tears to them. I could have gotten a better look at him, but I didn't want to. I'd seen enough. The smell of rot and decay mixed with the stench of his breath. Given Chuck's current state, it was no surprise. "Where do you think you're going, Ryan?" Chuck said in a calm voice. "Did you really plan to leave me here in the mountains, all alone with this freezing cold? Typical of you, always thinking only about yourself." He squeezed my leg so hard it felt like it was going to burst. I groaned in unbearable pain and noticed a small trickle of blood creeping up toward my face. This was not good. But fear locked my mind, just as the pain locked my body. I flailed in the air like a rag doll, trying to free myself from the werewolf's iron grip. It was useless. I only knew of one way to escape. But fear kept the words trapped in my throat, mixed with bile. Mustering every ounce of willpower, I managed to ask the monster, "What are you? What did you do to Chuck?" "I am Chuck," the creature roared angrily. "I've just changed my form. I'd love to tell you all the disgusting details, but I'm in a hurry, and you've delayed me long enough." "Damn it!" I shouted as he squeezed my leg tighter. The pain was so intense I nearly passed out. "What do you want from me, you filthy monster?" "A little harsh, but I'll pretend I didn't hear that," he growled, digging his razor-sharp claws into my leg. "I need to leave this place. Far, far away." "Then go. No one's stopping you, but leave me here." "No, I have to kill you. I can't leave anyone alive after what I've done." There was a faint hint of regret in his voice. "What have you done? Killing people is nothing new for you, is it?" I gasped as he grabbed me by the throat. He hadn't let go of my leg, clearly planning to rip me in half. "Well, it's time to say goodbye, Ryan. It's been nice knowing you." Chuck's last words hit me like a death sentence. I knew then that I had no chance of surviving. Everything in life should have meaning. Take life and death, for instance. Two seemingly different things. One gives you everything: knowledge, experience, love, friends. The other takes it all away. But it's foolish to view them separately. Life and death exist together. Yet why they exist isn't clear. The answer can only be found when you view them as two pieces of a puzzle created by the universe. You have to look at both the beginning and the end. But your eyes are only opened when you're standing on death's doorstep. And I don't believe in life after death, so I see no point in it all. I never thought I'd come to the point where I'd reflect on death. I'd always tried to steer clear of it, hide from it. But death is a master of hide and seek, living its life as a professional bloodhound. It roams around, always finding the places where I try to hide. The game of cat and mouse could go on forever, but everything must end. That's why death came for me. As I stared at Chuck, awaiting the inevitable, I noticed a faint movement behind his head. Mill was standing there, swaying from side to side. His entire body was covered in torn, bloody wounds. His face was both red with blood and pale from loss of it. Slowly, he raised his head, and his hands followed. Something gleamed in them before disappearing into the night. But I recognized it. It was the black sphere I had left in the snow. Who knew what Mill originally intended to use it for? But in this moment, it served perfectly as a weapon. The blow caught Chuck by surprise. Mill swung the black ball with all his strength, striking Chuck's massive head. I saw chunks of flesh and liquid the color of dawn that would never break, splatter across the ground. A deafening scream echoed through the mountains. I thought Mill had found a good way to wipe that twisted grin off the werewolf's face once and for all. Chuck let go of my throat, but unfortunately, his grip on my injured leg remained. I wasn't stuck for long, though. With a sickening sound, my leg was torn apart. He must have been hit with such a wave of pain that he reflexively squeezed my leg with all his might. I felt the same pain he did. The bone in my left leg stuck out, and my right leg no longer existed. I was tumbling down the mountainside, just as I had tried to earlier, only now with much worse injuries. It felt more like a suicide dive. The wounds and dizziness made me feel like I was being turned inside out. I was spinning through the air like a top, launched into the sky by the angel of death. I felt like a cog in some hellish machine. Nothing was holding me to the earth except the lingering flickers of fear, the quickly fading remnants of life, and the excruciating pain piercing my mind like tiny daggers. Blood poured from my leg, pulling me down into the depths of hell, leaving a dark trail in the snow for the demons with pitchforks to follow. My body flew over the ground, bouncing along as if propelled by a spring. I let all my muscles go limp, hoping the descent would be quicker and less painful. But I had forgotten about the pit Chuck had almost fallen into earlier. It was the last obstacle I had to overcome to escape this nightmare alive. By some miracle, I didn't fall in. My hands found a tree root sticking out of the snow just in time. Dangling over the abyss, I clung to that root with my frozen fingers, trying not to let go. My leg couldn't find any purchase. I could still feel both legs, but I knew I only had one. The other was just phantom pain. I was losing consciousness, reality slipping further and further away. It felt like I was no longer on Earth, but somewhere higher, hovering above the scales of Anubis, waiting for the divine judge's verdict. I had to snap out of this half-conscious state or I'd fall into the pit. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed my hand against the bone sticking out of my leg, unleashing a flood of pain that snapped me back to reality. Renewed by the pain, I felt a wave of energy course through my body, forcing me to continue. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to pull myself up, inch by inch, my fingers gripping the root as if it were my last lifeline. The muscles in my arms burned, each movement more agonizing than the last, but the pain kept me conscious, kept me alive. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to pull my chest over the edge of the pit and collapsed into the snow, exhausted and broken. I lay there, face down in the icy embrace of the mountain, letting the cold numb my thoughts and wash away the terror. Blood still poured from my ruined leg, staining the snow around me a deep crimson, but I no longer cared. I was alive, for now, and that was all that mattered. As I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, random thoughts filled my mind. I wondered if I'd left the faucet running at home. Was my apartment flooding, spilling water down into my neighbors' rooms? Funny, the absurd things that come to mind when you're on the brink of death. Mild flashes of light broke through the darkness in my vision. Dawn was finally creeping over the horizon. I rolled onto my back, gazing up at the faint glow in the sky. Morning had arrived, though it didn't feel like a new beginning for me. My eyes grew heavy, and I started to close them, feeling my body surrendering to the overwhelming need for rest. But my mind screamed at me to stay awake, to keep fighting. A wave of cold swept over me, but I didn't shiver. It wasn't from the snow or the mountain's bitter wind. It was the cold touch of death, wrapping itself around me, inviting me into its grasp. I couldn't tell if the rescue team was coming. Maybe they were on their way, but I no longer held out hope. I had to forget about them. Forget about Chuck and Mill. Forget about the twisted mess of everything that had just happened. Forget about the rat, the dead body at the gas station, and the horrifying transformations that turned my friends into monsters. I let my eyelids fall shut, sinking deeper into the abyss of unconsciousness. Maybe sleep would free me from this pain. Finally, I slipped into oblivion. When I woke, my head throbbed, a pounding ache radiating from my temples. It didn't feel like death. No, death wouldn't feel this painful, would it? Slowly, I forced my eyes open. It took immense effort, but they obeyed. I blinked, focusing on my surroundings. I was lying in a hospital bed. A drip stood beside me, feeding a steady stream of fluids into my arm. I'm alive? I thought, incredulous. Was everything that happened in the mountains just a hallucination brought on by the cold? I pulled back the blanket and looked down at my legs. My stomach churned. One leg was wrapped tightly in a cast, but the other was gone, leaving behind only a stump. The sight of the severed limb confirmed what my mind was struggling to deny. It wasn't a hallucination. Everything that had happened was real. As if on cue, I heard footsteps approaching. A figure came into view as soon as they realized I was awake. Standing at the foot of my bed was an older man in a lab coat. His hair was as white as freshly fallen snow, and thick-rimmed glasses sat on his weathered face. His expression, lined with years of experience, was gentle but serious. He knew everything about my condition without having to say a word. This was Dr. Gin Favre, the hospital's head surgeon, and as it happened, an old friend of mine. "It's been a while, Ryan," he greeted me in a calm, soft voice. "Yeah, a year to be exact. Could you—" I began, but before I could finish, he handed me my old glasses, the ones with the cracked lens. I had lent them to him a year ago during an important surgery. He had forgotten his own at home, and no one was going to let a blind surgeon operate. He'd moved from surgeon to hospital director since then, a well-deserved promotion. I put on the glasses and the room came into sharper focus. I could finally see the details of the room, the colors, and Jin's face. "Seems like you need them more than I do now," he said with a small smile. "What happened to me?" I asked, staring at him as if he could provide answers to the universe's greatest mysteries. "You don't remember anything yourself?" "I do, but a professional opinion couldn't hurt." "All right," he said, picking up the patient report hanging from the bed's rail. "Your left leg is in pretty bad shape. Several tendons are torn, and the tibia is fractured. As for your right leg, well, you already know. You also broke a few ribs, but luckily there were no serious injuries to any vital organs." He placed the report back. "When they found you, it looked like your life was already in God's hands. I'd say you owe your survival to fate. But as your doctor, I'd like to know how you managed to break your body like this." "In the mountains. It all happened there." "Did a bear attack you or something?" "If only," I muttered, thinking carefully about whether to tell him everything that had happened that night. But even I wasn't sure if I believed any of it. Monsters, transformations, it all seemed like a bad dream, or maybe some kid threw a rock through the window of reality. I don't know what it was exactly, but I'm sure that what I saw wasn't entirely real. "Even if it wasn't, everything that happened to you shouldn't be dismissed as just a dream. But don't tell me a Yeti was responsible for all this," he joked, smiling. I smiled back. A grin after a long sleep felt just as refreshing as a hot cup of dark coffee. I wasn't alone. "Chuck and Mill were with me the whole time," I said, pausing for a moment. If Chuck and Mill were also in the hospital, then everything that had happened on that mountain was just a fabrication. If they weren't, well, then I had a direct ticket to a psychiatrist. 3 people entered the room without knocking. 2 stood by the door, while the 3rd approached me and Dr. Jin. It was Police Chief Brown Wenton, a tall man in his mid-30s with thick mustaches and a tan that didn't quite match the snowy environment. "Hello, Ryan. Dr. Jin. I see the patient is alive and well." Brown flashed his usual practiced smile, the same one he used during interviews with the press. "The patient is recovering. He lost a lot of blood, so what he needs now is rest and sleep," Jin replied. "That's good to hear," Brown said, shifting his gaze from the doctor to me. "I've got a few questions for you, Ryan. Think you can answer them?" "What do you want to know from a poor, battered man like me, Chief Brown?" I replied, playing up my condition. "Just the name and description of the person who did this to you," he said bluntly, throwing me off guard. A vivid image of the giant monster tearing off my leg flashed in my mind, but I figured it was best not to worsen the situation with my traumatic memories. I decided to explain what had happened, omitting the part about the creature that had nearly dragged me to the gates of heaven or hell along with the blizzard. "I went up into the mountains with Chuck and Mill." "What for?" Brown asked, sounding wary. "We were looking for a crashed plane." "Got it. I should probably scold you for such a reckless and dangerous move, but you've already paid the price. Go on." When we got to a decent height, Mill stopped to relieve himself behind a tree. Chuck and I waited, listening to the radio for him to return. "We overheard you talking to a reporter about the body at the gas station." Brown nodded slowly, as if remembering the event. I continued. "After that, we lost sight of Mill. He never came back. Chuck and I had to continue up the mountain alone. Chuck nearly fell into a cave hidden under the snow, but I managed to save him. After resting for a bit, we climbed toward where we thought the plane would be. I hesitated, unsure of what to say next. Going on about monsters while lying in a hospital bed didn't seem like a way to gain anyone's trust. Not Brown's, and certainly not my own. I don't remember what happened after that. Interesting story, Brown said, clearly not believing that I'd forgotten the rest. He scratched his mustache before adding, "It's a shame you don't remember. You're essentially the only survivor, the only one who might have seen the killer. Your testimony could help us a great deal with the investigation." "What about Chuck and Mill?" I asked, hoping to hear that they were alive and recovering, just as I was, but couldn't recall what had happened either. Instead, my worst fears rushed to the surface, swirling in my mind like witches on brooms. Brown's voice reached me, sharp and distant, like the growl of a chainsaw in the night. "We haven't found them, but we have some information that might help jog your memory about where they might have gone." "Tell me," I said, my impatience growing with each breath. "We found the body of a guy named Nod Heusler." "Nod Heusler?" I repeated, trying to recall the name. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. As I pondered Chuck Mill and Nod Heusler, Brown asked Ginn if smoking was allowed in the room. After receiving a firm no, he pulled out a cigar and matches anyway. Ignoring the doctor's disapproving glances, he lit the cigar, puffing thoughtfully before speaking again. "Nod Heusler was known around town as the Rat. He was the biggest gossip you could imagine, always spreading rumors. But it looks like the story about the plane was his last." "Why do you think it was his story?" I asked, curious. "Because..." Brown exhaled a thick cloud of smoke before finishing his sentence. "Mill said so. Mill talked to the Rat before heading into the mountains, then called the rescue team, and apparently you too," I muttered, feeling the anger rising within me. Brown's words sounded dangerously close to accusing Mill of murder. And as strange as it seemed, I found myself trying to defend him. "Yeah, Mill called the rescue team about the downed plane, but that was 10 minutes before he called us. We had time to check the information," Brown continued, as Ginn quietly left the room, sensing the conversation had drifted away from casual patient talk. "But here's where it gets interesting. Do you know where Mill made the call from? From your mom's house?" I tried to mask my growing frustration with humor. "No." Brown didn't appreciate the joke. "From the Rat's house." "What are you talking about? Why are you trying to pin this on Mill?" "I don't remember saying Mill was responsible, but we have grounds to suspect him. Now please hear me out. I came here to tell you what's been happening in town over the last few days. You have to understand it's painful for me to hear accusations against my friends. My body is in a wreck, and nothing will ever bring it back to normal. I'm suffering from a severe headache, and all I want to do is sleep." I noticed a flicker of sympathy on Brown's face. Either he understood my pain, or he was just as eager to leave the sickness-filled room. "But I still want to hear your version of events. I need to know what really happened to me that night on that damned mountain." "How long have you known Chuck and Mill?" "I've known Mill for 3 years and Chuck for 2. When I met Mill, he was working part-time at a news station. I went to the studio to interview one of the hosts about rumors of him cheating on his wife with a guy from the 6th channel. Security nearly beat me up for that question, but Mill saved me." "How did he help you?" Brown asked, clearly interested in the story. "He threatened, charmed, and fought his way through. I don't think the details matter, but I've got a scar on my left arm from that day." Dr. Ginn returned and mentioned we had 5 more minutes to wrap up the conversation before he'd have to escort the officers out. "And what about Chuck?" Brown asked. sneaking a quick puff from another cigar while Jin wasn't looking. Mill introduced me to him at a bar, said he was the best photographer he'd ever seen, and we needed a good photographer for the paper. Chuck pretty much pays for our drinks whenever we go out now. And what do you know about your companions' pasts? I didn't ask much about their pasts. All I know is Chuck used to work as a photographer in Miami. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe it was just a draft, but my gut told me otherwise. I started to question their reasons for befriending me. I'd told them everything about my life, but they'd kept theirs hidden. Why the secrecy? Well, I did some digging. I like to know everything about everyone. It's the only way to keep the town under control. Spit it out already then. Don't keep me waiting. Chuck was never in Miami. I called around. Nobody's heard of him. And the newspaper he showed off as proof. A forgery. Brown paused, watching for my reaction. But I just lay there listening. I'd never fully believed Chuck's Miami story, but he talked about the place like he'd lived there his whole life. And after he appeared in town, those brutal dismemberment murders started happening. We're not saying Chuck did it, but we can't rule it out, especially after learning something else. Chief Brown, I appreciate the endless stream of information you're pouring out here, but could you provide more concrete evidence before accusing my friends of murder? The pain surged through my body like molten lava. Maybe the news acted as a trigger, but pain and doubt now filled my mind. Could one of my friends really be a killer? The thought lodged itself in my brain alongside the pain, neither of them leaving anytime soon. The rat was a good informant. You and your friends used him, and he used you. You knew about his drug problem, Brown said, and I nodded in agreement. 2 years ago, alongside the new bodies, a new type of drug began circulating in town. We struggled to track down the person responsible for distributing it. None of the buyers could give us a clear description of the dealer, but 2 days ago, someone finally agreed to help us identify him. Given how much product had passed through his hands, he wasn't just a dealer, he was a drug lord. You found an informant? Don't tell me it was the rat. It was him, Brown said, smiling for the first time in our long conversation. He was supposed to help us bust a big drug shipment today, but without him we've lost our lead. I haven't seen a cop work this hard in a long time. I was promised that if I found the supplier of this new drug, I'd get a promotion, Brown began, his voice serious. Now let's get to the point. Mill and Chuck have to be connected to the drug trade. It's possible that one of them is the drug lord we've been looking for. But to prove it, we need a witness, at least one. You need me? But what can I do? I didn't get to finish before Brown cut me off abruptly. I know you can remember who did this to you. Truth be told, we can't say for sure that they're both guilty, but one of them is. One of them is the killer, the one who took your leg in that forest, the one who killed the rat. It wasn't a person, I shouted, my voice cracking as the words echoed in my mind. It was a beast. A monster did this to me, not a man. Are you sure? Personally, I doubt that very much. I saw the monster with my own eyes. Maybe it was a hallucination or something, but it wasn't human. No one human could do that. And are you sure what you saw and heard was a monster and not something else? Could there have been something unusual in the monster's behavior? Brown's questions were grating, strange. It was as if he knew exactly what had happened to me, but was waiting to hear the truth directly from me. It spoke to me. That was the strangest part. I heard the monster's voice, I admitted, my anger shifting to confusion. They could have dosed you with that new drug. Do you know anything about it? No, nothing. I hesitated. Brown's suggestion made sense. a reasonable explanation for my bizarre experience in the mountains. This is the first time I'm hearing about a new drug in town. That would have made for a great story. People call it arrancando el techo. It's Spanish for ripping off the roof. It's rumored to have been developed in Brazil as a kind of LSD substitute. But it has one very interesting feature. Brown paused dramatically, just like he did on the radio. At high doses, users experience vivid hallucinations. But they don't realize it because the body stays calm while the mind runs wild. You feel sane, but you think you've gone mad. I suspect your friends decided to get rid of the rat when they sensed the police closing in. And they wanted to eliminate you because you might have figured out who they really are. He fell silent, and I realized it was time to tell him the whole truth. Sooner or later I'd have to tell someone, and though Chief Brown wasn't the ideal candidate, it was worth a shot. Chuck and Mill fought on the mountain. Chuck transformed into a giant bear-like monster, and Mill turned into some weirdly dressed sheriff from the future. If anyone was the villain, it was Chuck. He's the one who tore off my leg, but Mill saved me. I rolled down the hill and blacked out, thinking it was the end. Then I woke up here, saved by the rescue team, I guess, and ended up in this hospital. I stopped talking. The room fell into a thick silence. I could almost hear their thoughts, frantic, confused, swirling in their heads. After a moment of pause, Dr. Ginn finally spoke up. "Sounds crazy, but I'd like to correct you on one thing. You weren't found by the rescue team." "Who brought me here then?" I asked, surprised by what Ginn had said. "An ambulance found you by the road, just outside the forest leading to the hospital. You were lying there as if you had just been dumped on the side of the road, and there was a backpack near your body." Brown's face shifted, his expression tightening. "So one of them must have carried you out. Likely Mill, if we're to believe your account. That means Chuck is the one responsible for all this," he said, just as his radio crackled to life. "I've got to go. Duty calls. Get well soon, Ryan." "Goodbye, Dr. Ginn," Brown said, turning to leave. He exited the room with the two silent officers who had been standing by the door. "Looks like Chuck really is the culprit," I muttered to myself. "I've been dragged into some drug war. Disgusting." "I think Brown's wrong," Dr. Ginn said, his voice steady with conviction. He sounded so sure of himself, as though he'd bet his life on it. "Either he's right or everything I saw was real. As disgusting as it is, I'd rather Brown be right than me. But he forgot about Mill." "What do you mean, forgot?" I asked, surprised by Jinn's sudden involvement in all this. This wasn't like him. If Brown is right, then Mill saved you and killed Chuck on that mountain. But if that's true, why did he disappear with Chuck's body? You've got a point, but what if they were both in on it? Then who dropped you by the roadside? Like on that mountain, I found no meaning in life or death. On one side, there was a lie, and on the other, an impossible truth. Separately, neither made any sense or explained why any of this had happened. But there was no way to check. No bodies, no traces, nothing. You couldn't consider all possibilities when they contradicted each other so completely. But like the life and death dilemma, they had something in common. I stopped thinking about it. Ginn could see I was exhausted and told me the best medicine now was a good night's sleep. He walked toward the door to turn off the light, but stopped halfway and turned to me. "I think you should take a look at your backpack. If you insist, bring it here." "I'd actually been meaning to check on my first aid kit," I replied. He left the room and returned just as quickly, carrying my battered, torn backpack. He opened it for me and placed it on the bed. "Why do you think I need it?" I asked, curious. But Gin didn't answer. Instead, he said he had other matters to attend to and reminded me that if I needed anything, the nurse call button was on the left side of the bed. Then he left me alone. I first pulled out the first aid kit, which was useless in an emergency. I set it aside on the bedside table. The bag was filled with canned goods and shattered bottles of brandy. But at the bottom of the bag, something else caught my eye. Something I hadn't expected to find. With difficulty, I pulled it out and recognized it immediately. It was the black orb. I recognized it by the 3 strange indentations. Blood dripped from the orb. I knew that Mill had struck Chuck, or the monster, with it. As proof of my suspicions, a crack ran along the top of the object, nearly splitting it in half. Of all the items in the bag, this one felt the most real and unreal at the same time. I believed the orb might hold the answer to what had really happened on the mountain. All I had to do was crack it open and see what was inside. Gripping the weakest part of the orb, I pulled with all my strength, my muscles straining. My heart pounded with anticipation. In my eagerness, I sliced my middle finger open. I managed to rip off a piece of the orb, and then another. Finally, I could see what it had been hiding. Cold, empty nothingness. Just like the emptiness I felt in my body and mind. I tossed the orb and the backpack onto the floor. Taking off my glasses, I set them on the table. Pressing the button hanging on the bed, I turned off the lights in the room. I thought about everything and nothing. I knew that as soon as I left the hospital, cops and reporters would swarm me for interviews and answers. I knew there'd be plenty of work waiting for me at the paper. And I knew life would never be the same. But above all, I was heartbroken for a different reason. I had lost my friends and become a cripple. Those were the 2 things that could never be changed. I got comfortable in bed, and just before drifting off to sleep, one final thought crossed my mind. I know what the worst part would be. Waking up tomorrow to Chuck's face in front of me. Then life truly wouldn't make sense. And why is it so cold in here? Which idiot turned off the heat? When I get out of here, I'll find Mill. I know he's alive. I still need answers from him. And in the darkness, the shattered orb lay on the floor. Inside the hole Ryan had made, smoke swirled, forming glowing blue letters. They spelled out a message, which Ryan saw just before discarding the orb. The universe has split in 2. You're on one side, your friends on the other. Find the portal or you'll share their fate.